Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to 30 on Thursdays, SusQtech's bi-weekly webinar series about anything and everything to do with SharePoint. I'm going to go ahead and go through some logistical housekeeping issues before we jump into today's topic. Again, for those of you joining us for the first time, 30 on Thursdays is a bi-weekly 30-minute series where we talk about all topics related to SharePoint. Our next one is coming up on December 13th. That is the top 10 features of SharePoint 2013. You won't want to miss that. Talking about all the cool stuff coming out in the next release of SharePoint. And you can get the full schedule of all of our upcoming webinars at susqtech.com/webinars. Today's session is being recorded and will be available, as well as all of our past sessions going back for the last year or so, are archived on our website at susqtech.com/archive-webinars. And if you have any questions during today's presentation, please use the question window at the right. We will hold all questions to the end just to allow the presenters to get through the material, and then we'll handle the questions at the end. We also at SusQtech offer a number of online classes in a web-based format similar to this. These are 3-hour paid training, and we have some coming up that you may be interested in. We have one tomorrow, which is Intro to SharePoint 2010. We also have a 2-day training class on Nintex Workflow, which is an online class coming up December 11th and 12th. And then we have a 3-hour webinar in December on maximizing search in SharePoint 2010. So if you're interested in any of our longer training classes, those are available on our website at susqtech.com/online training. And we have recordings of some of our past training sessions available for sale on our website as well. You can get those at the same location. So without further ado, we're going to jump into today's topic, which is a new twist on SharePoint migration. Our presenters today are Stephen Moore and David Weiss from Kapow. We've been working with Kapow and talking to Kapow for a couple of years now, and they have kind of a unique twist on migration for SharePoint. That's a little bit different than maybe some of the other products out in the marketplace, in that it's not necessarily SharePoint specific. So it allows you to migrate content from maybe some non-SharePoint sources into SharePoint using their software. So we're going to take a look at that today, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Stephen. Stephen, are you there?
Yep. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate the introduction. I'll go ahead and set this up so I can see here. So again, Steve, thanks for the introduction. My name's Stephen Moore. I'm responsible for the content migration vertical here at Kapow Software. We are planning on taking you through just a couple slides to kind of show you know, what we do and how we do it, and then wanted to spend the remaining time in an actual product demonstration. So we'll go very quickly through these slides. But before we start, as Steve mentioned, there's quite a few players in the migration space, particularly within SharePoint. What makes Kapow different is we've got the only software in the marketplace that can automate a migration from any source of content outside of SharePoint. So if you've got a source of static content, vignette, interwoven, Oracle, doesn't really matter what it is, we've got the only software in the marketplace that can automate that end to end, as opposed to all the other players in the industry that are focused on moving from SharePoint to SharePoint. So definitely a unique twist on migration. A little bit about Kapow. We're headquartered in Palo Alto, backed by Disney Steamboat Ventures, working with over 600 customers at this point across every major vertical, as you can see here. So the first part of what we offer in a content migration is we can help you with your source and template analysis. So if you've got 10,000 pages of content, we can tell you, well, first of all, confirm exactly how many pages you do have, how many links, how many broken links, how many PDFs, how many images. But beyond that quantitative perspective, we can also give you a qualitative perspective, help you understand how many templates you have across those pages, and how each page maps to each one of those templates. Historically, it's been a very manual process where you had to go through and page by page figure out, what does this content look like, where are these templates, and how am I going to map them over? We would not map them over for you, but we would give you a huge head start by letting you know, what does the content look like today, certainly in terms of consistency and from a quantitative perspective. Once we've done that inventory and template analysis, we would look for you and SusQtech to do that mapping over into the new SharePoint templates. From there, our software can certainly extract the content, do all the transformations, load into SharePoint 2013, and then so obviously it can be published out to the relevant audiences. So Intel was a pretty typical case study for us, maybe not so much in the amount of pages that they had. With 300,000, that was a lot, but they had 300,000 pages in many, many different disparate data systems, and it estimated that it was going to take them 2 years with 45 developers to complete the migration. They found Kapow. We were able to cut that time down by a tenth, reduce the cost by 90%, do it with 100% accuracy. And really, you know, they were looking at the same challenges that anybody's looking at in a migration from outside of SharePoint into SharePoint. You know, extremely high cost, managing an army of folks writing scripts, a lot of time bringing things back into compliance, fixing errors, also huge disruptions to the business where you've got to ask the business to freeze the content because you don't have a way to track deltas in the migration process. We do have this as a recorded session where the Chief Content Architect talks about how they were able to overcome these challenges and achieve these benefits. It gets recorded. Be happy to send that to anybody that's interested. So at the highest level here, the way that we do this is we can go to any web source, you know, any repository, and extract the content from the front end. So we'll extract the content from the front end and place that into an intermediary database with the relationships and links intact. So if you can get all your content off the website into a database with those relationships and links intact, you're way ahead of the ballgame. Now, certainly if there's some metadata or something that's not in the UI, certainly we can go into the actual CMS and grab that. But we're talking about staging everything in an intermediary database with relationships and links intact. From there, literally anything that you would do in code to transform the content, the metadata, or taxonomy can be completely automated inside our visual design environment, and then from there we can, of course, load directly into SharePoint. Now, this also has a great play for search because, you know, the two biggest problems, hands down, in search today are people's inability to get access to their own content as well as normalize and enrich the metadata. The search is only going to be as good as your metadata, and if you don't have a way to get access to your metadata and a way to enrich, normalize the metadata, then you know, the search is going to be a little suspect. So again, the software is certainly adept at doing that. We can integrate with any third-party ontology classification system, any source of business logic that you would want to put on the metadata. We can automate that entire process for improved enterprise search. This is the actual the visual design environment in which all this takes place. We're going to spend about 10 minutes here kind of showing you how this works, but as you can see here, very visual. Across the top are what we call robots. They are the mechanisms that perform the actual different steps in the migration. And down here, you can see in real time, we're validating that the content's coming back as it should. So very integrated, seamless design process here. So at the end of the day, if you're migrating from you know, vignette, interwoven, a source of static content, any source outside of SharePoint into SharePoint, you are either going to be manually copy and pasting, you're going to write a lot of code, or you're going to use Kapow. We'd certainly argue that the first two approaches are you know, quite outdated. There's going to be a lot of unforeseen challenges, a lot of manual process, and you know, talk to Forrester, talk to Gartner, 90% of the time it's going to go over time and over budget. You know, the first two approaches, again, very service intensive. You're not going to have any sort of reliable completion dates, lots of errors, and content freeze. Kapow certainly addresses all of those, as we'll demonstrate here. And last slide before we jump into the actual product demonstration. I apologize for going so fast, but would like to spend as much time as possible in the demonstration. So last slide. So this slide really speaks to how we mitigate the risk in a migration. Inevitably, there's going to be a lot of unforeseen challenges. You're going to have a lot of changes and tweaks to SharePoint templates. You know, as the content comes in, you know, well, the business is going to say, well, actually, we changed our mind. We want this template done this way now that the content's coming in. So all of these business rule changes that you're going to have to accommodate in the course of a migration, all the outliers that you hadn't identified are going to have to be accounted for. And that's going to create a very iterative process. And historically, when this is done in code, you've got to go in as these business rules transpire and identify the outliers. You go into the code, you make a change. First of all, you got to find what in the code needs to be changed. You recode it, you run the code, and then you try to match up in all these isolated design environments that the content is coming back as you want it to. very cumbersome process, arduous process that could take, days or weeks. And we've got hundreds or potentially thousands of iterations. Very hard to even begin to quantify your risk. With Kapow, in real time, we can find exactly what we want to change, make that change, run it, and validate it. Again, in real time, one environment. So you just took a process that has historically taken days and weeks, literally down to minutes, which is exactly how we mitigate the risk in these migrations. So the whole point is to do this with certainly fewer company resources. SusQtech is quite adept at doing these migrations with Kapow. Certainly, if your team wants to take it on, you can do that as well. But we're talking about doing it with much fewer resources. Whoever's doing it with 100% accuracy and on time and on budget. Any questions following this session? You can reach me at stephen.moore@kapowsoftware.com. And David, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter to back up all my bold claims here.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Okay, so I'm going to show just 2 more slides about our methodology before I jump into the product. I want you to understand how we do what we do. So this slide speaks to how we access different sources of content. We can access content directly from the website visually. That's going to be the main way that we get the content. But if there's metadata that's hidden in the old CMS system that you're migrating from, we can get that content also using the API calls. We can get content from database systems, from file systems. For all of these approaches, we have pre-made steps that you drop into the visual environment in order to access these different systems, and that content is then extracted in Kapow's Design Studio and mapped into an intermediate database. Now, the intermediate database table structure is going to be based on the template structure that you're loading into in SharePoint. So the prerequisite for this content migration is that you've decided on your taxonomy, what type of data structures, and what library targets in SharePoint that you're going to have. Once you've made those decisions, you can then use Kapow to implement that logic, to implement the mapping rules and the transformation rules to get your content and your metadata mapped into those data structures. And once we've done that, this is an iterative process, as Stephen mentioned. This load into this intermediate database is going to happen numerous times until you've validated that the content is exactly how you want it, and you'll have robots that can help with that validation. I'll show you what a robot is here in a minute. And once you finish that process, going through this loading to the intermediate database, and you've validated the content, from there we do the load of the SharePoint system. So the first part, the extraction and the transformation and load of the intermediate database, you may go through that numerous times until the content is perfect and validated, and then the load occurs. So to begin a content migration project, we first do a crawl of the website. That's the first robot that I'll show, is a robot that crawls the website, collects all the URLs that make up the entire content, all the assets, and then we'll take the binary content, the images, the PDFs, and we'll download those to the intermediate hard drive, keep track of where those are in the intermediate database for loading into SharePoint, and then we'll begin to iterate through all the HTML content, parsing that content out, mapping it into the proper data templates, adding the metadata as specified, doing any transformations on that content, and then the load follows. So let me go ahead and show you guys the Design Studio. This is what it looks like. Across the top here is the robot, the step-by-step instructions for how we're interacting with the content that we have loaded in the web browser window here, the main window. This is Kapow's web browser. It's the most powerful browser in the market. It does everything that IE, Firefox, and Chrome can do. In addition to that, I can interact with the content on the page. I can click anything on the page, and then once I've clicked on something, I can right-click and define a step, what I want to do to that. Do I want to extract it? Do I want to test the value? Does the value contain a certain value? Does it begin with, end with a value? Create some loops to go through the page programmatically, modify the content. Any one of these type of steps. Over here to the right are all of the steps that I can create here. You can see we've got steps to allow us to interact with database systems. We can interact with any database system that exists as long as there's a JDBC driver for it. We can interact with file systems, so I can loop through a network drive. You could point to a root directory and say include all subdirectories, find all PDF files, and then I can open those PDF files inside of the browser here. So instead of just HTML, we can also look at CSV, XML, Excel, Flash, PDF files. So we're actually able to open these binary files, extract metadata from them in a meaningful way, map it to the data structure that we've defined. So down here to the right is where I define my various data structures to do whatever task that it is that I'm trying to accomplish. So the task of this first robot is simply to create a list of all the URLs that make up a site. So this is an inventory crawler. And so the first thing we're doing is loading the seed page for the website, the very first page. And then the next step is the operative step for this robot. It's the for each URL step. And what that does is it finds the URLs on the page. So I'm stepping through the page, one URL at a time. And then for each of these URLs, I'll do all of the following steps. So the first thing we're going to do with each URL is extract that value. And here it's extracted into the URL attribute. And then from there, I can begin to do logical checking on that value. So the first test I'm going to do is check if it belongs to the domain of the website that I'm crawling. So you can see here's that condition here to the right. I'll click on that, and we can see that the condition says that this variable contains the name of the domain. And I can also make this does not contain, starts with, ends with, or whatever other logical operation that I need to do. I can create other types of logical steps that follow. We can have as many as we need to pipe together here. And so this first test is going to say, does it belong to the domain? Here you can see visually, it doesn't. So when I try to get to the next step, Kapow puts up a dialog box that says, didn't pass the test, you can't go past this step. So this is validating how these steps are executing right here into the Design Studio. They're actually being executed as I pass the steps. So I can see that they're functioning as they should be. So just like at runtime, I'll go to get the next element from the loop. Now I'm looking at the 15th URL on the page, and we can see that that does contain aopalert.com, and I will be able to pass this test. The next three tests are going to disqualify certain URLs that are part of the domain. So these three buttons over here are CMS-generated buttons that don't represent any new content. And you can see visually that the URL that I have selected is not one of these buttons. And so sure enough, we'll be able to pass these disqualifying tests. Now the URL is included in our inventory, and we're going to get the content type of that URL, and we're going to set that as our content type down here to the bottom right. You can see it's currently blank. When I pass the step, there we've got our content type set as an HTML page. Now I want to actually load that page to validate that it's not a broken link. And if it was a broken link, what I would do in this next step is grab that status code from the page. And then the last thing I'm doing is storing this information in the database. So now I'm storing the URL, the type of URL, and any status codes associated with that URL. And so I'm going to go to debug mode. The design mode that I'm in currently allows me to make changes to the robot, add steps. And now once I design the robot, I want to actually run it or test it, I go to the debug mode, and some of my options change here. You can see I've got a different set of buttons up above. I'm going to hit the play button and run through this robot, and we can watch as all of the URLs collected and as the content type is assigned to each of these URLs. There's a PDF file. Most of the other ones are HTML pages so far, and all that's getting mapped into my intermediate database that, in this case, I'm using a MySQL database table. You could use anything. Microsoft SQL, Oracle, DB2, whatever you want to use. So once the inventory is done running, we're going to start the process of extracting the content. So the first robot I'm going to show here, a very simple robot. We're just extracting the binary files. We're not doing anything special here. We're just going to the intermediate database, our inventory, and we're saying show all files that are either resources or PDFs. So anything that's not an HTML file. And this next step allows me to save that file on the website to the local hard drive. And I'm now going to say the file size. And now I'm storing all that information in my intermediate database. Where did I save the file? What's the file size? Let's keep track of that in the intermediate database. Go to debug mode, run the robot, and we can see all the binary files being grabbed from the website very quickly and saved to the intermediate hard drive. So now all those binary files are at our disposal, easily accessible, and ready to load to SharePoint. So the next step is going to be doing the same thing for the HTML content. So you can see the first step looks the same. It's a query to the inventory database, but here's the SQL statement. In this case, we're querying for all the content types equal to page, and then for each of those HTML pages, we're going to load it into the browser. And now I can begin to manipulate the content, parse it out, look at the menu structure, whatever I need to do to determine what the content is that I'm extracting, what the metadata is, and then I'm going to map it into the data structure that I have down here to the bottom right. Now, depending on the page structure and how many different elements there are on the page, I could have 3, 4, 5 different data structures over here to the right, and I could be populating each of those as I crawl the page and extract the content. So the first thing I want to do is clean up the page a little bit. There's this tag that overlays the content. I don't need that tag. It's not going to be migrated. So I can just click on it, go to Modify, and say remove this tag. So when I pass by this step that I just created, the remove tag step, it's eliminated from the screen. So I can manipulate the content as I'm crawling the page. The next thing I'm going to do is get the category value for the articles on this page. So the objective of this robot is to extract all of the articles from every page of the website where there is an article. So the first value for these articles is the category of the article. Now that value is not obviously part of the article. It's instead inferred from the menu structure here in the HTML. So I'm actually going to have to understand the HTML a little bit for this extraction step. So we're looking at the HTML down below here, and we can see that the menu structure is made up of li tags, and the one field that we're interested in is marked as the active item. The other ones are not. So I'm going to create a find tag step, defines an li tag, an active item attribute. When I pass by this step, it identifies that field. It's the home field is the active item, and when I pass by that step, it's going to extract the value into the category value. And that extraction step is built just like all of these other steps, interacting with the page. I right-click on the screen. I say I want to extract. Just want to extract the text. I don't need the HTML. It's not a number or structured date. And I'm putting that into the title attribute. I click on this. It creates a step up above. When I pass the step, it populates that value. So there's the home value. And now we're going to get all of the other values for this article directly from the article itself. Now, as I mentioned, there's more than one article per page, so I have to create another loop. So this is a loop within a loop. The outer loop is going through all the HTML pages. The inner loop is going through all the articles on each page. So I'm going to click on the page, and now I can move up the document object model structure with these buttons here up above until I have the tags selected that represent that article. And as you can see now, I've got the first article outlined on the page. I'm going to right-click inside that article and create a for each tag loop. So when I create this loop step up above, that's going to identify every tag structure on the page that looks similar to this tag structure. In other words, it's going to identify all of the articles. So now, each of these extraction steps that I create inside of this first blue box, this first article, will then be applied to every article on the page and then every article on the site. So we're going to create these extraction steps like this. I select the title. I want to extract that as simple text, put it in the title attribute. That creates this step. I pass the step, and there's the title. Same thing with the subtitle. And you can see the configuration for these steps over here to the right. I can have converters added. You can see my extract subtitle step. I'm just extracting it. There's no converters. Now my date, I've created a converter here, as you can see. And this step was created the same way. Right-click, extract it as a date, put it into my date attribute. That creates a step. And then I come over here, and I can add converters. So I've added a converter that takes the format of the date and time from the current format and changes it into the specified format here. And I can choose that from my drop-down box, any date and time format that exists, and any language or locale that exists. So all of these converters are fully built out like this, and I can add as many as I need to each step, depending on the complexity of the transformation that I'm doing. So for the next one, we're doing another transformation. We're extracting the article's author name. We're doing a regular expression to change the first name, last name around, and comma separate them. You can see I make changes to the regular expression up above, and the results are seen down below in the test window, so I can validate that this regular expression is functioning how I would like it to. I can create this regular expression from this lookup table, so I don't have to be a regular expression expert. I can drop in all the components that I need here, validate that it's doing what I want it to, proceed ahead, add another converter if I need to. I can hit the plus sign. I can look at all sorts of converters here. We've got text formatting, adding text before or after, replacing text, replacing patterns, removing special characters, removing spaces, number handling, arithmetic functions, date handling like we looked at, HTML handling. If I extract HTML, I can specify a set of tags to remove, maybe just remove the text-related font tags, keep all of the other ones. I can do all sorts of changing of formats. I can export this as XML, JSON, CSV, any type of encoding or decoding. Anything you would do in code or scripting, we've got a pre-made converter here that you can drop in quickly and apply to the appropriate step. So anything you do in coding or scripting, we've got it already built here, much quicker to work with, easier to find, easier to modify. And as I go forward here, I'm going to extract the body of the article as HTML. So now I've got my article fields all populated here, ready to be stored in my intermediate database.
Sorry to interrupt. We're really a little bit out of time here. Certainly, okay. We're willing to go in depth for the extraction, transformation, or loading process into SharePoint offline. We've got 30 minutes here. It looks like we've got about 3 minutes left. We want to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, hey, Stephen, thanks. I did have one. I know we kind of gave you, you kind of ran out of time here, but I would like, for the benefit of our audience, to maybe briefly look at the loading process, which really kind of works in the similar format to extracting, right? But you're actually going walking through and putting it in the proper location in SharePoint, so that those fields that you guys migrated, or that I basically identified and extracted data from, like the author field, you can turn around and put it into the author field on the appropriate page layout content type within SharePoint. So I was wondering if you could spend maybe like a minute and just show the kind of the SharePoint side of things.
Absolutely. Let me speak to that really quickly here. We have two approaches to load to SharePoint. If you have a site that's, say, 5,000 or 10,000 elements or less, there's certainly no reason not to just build a simple robot that loads through SharePoint's web front end. That means I can load content into SharePoint just like you would as a human. And once I've gone through the steps of loading one content element into SharePoint, I can then add loop steps that say, okay, now loop through this database of content and do the exact same set of steps that I just performed in the visual web front end to all of these content elements that I have in my intermediate database. And that's a very effective way to load, say, 10,000 or less items into SharePoint. Now, if you get up into gigabytes of content, hundreds of thousands of records, now I would recommend that you go to our other approach where we've leveraged SharePoint's content migration API, and we've built some robots that load content much quicker. This is adequate if it's 10,000 or less elements. If you've got more, we've got an API that will load the content much, much quicker. And another thing that we've developed is the ability to load all of your versioning into SharePoint, whether it's from an old version of SharePoint, from a network share, from any other resource. Load those versions into SharePoint and set the author name. So you're not just setting it as the author of the person that's registered into SharePoint, but you're setting it as whatever value you want. And then you're also able to set the date of the original date of that version. So it's not just being re-timestamped. So those are some of the features that we can do from the API that we cannot do from the web front end. So in other words, when I'm logged into here to SharePoint, the user that I'm logged in as is going to be the user that's associated with the new items that are added. Another way to do that, of course, is to load the content in this way and then use the API to then go and modify the dates and the owner of the document. So you can see here on that, I'm able to actually iterate through values in one version of SharePoint, extract these files, these images, and then save them in my intermediate database, go back into another version of SharePoint, and load them into there. So very intuitive ability to do this in the visual environment.
Right, and and you don't have to actually go from, you know, a non-SharePoint data source into SharePoint. You can use it to pretty much go from anything to anything. And the majority of the work is really in defining the bots and setting up the bots, and then the execution is really when all the content migration actually happens.
That's right.
Okay, I'm going to jump into some questions because we're right at the top of the hour, and there are just a couple of questions I want to cover. So when you showed the example, David, of the AOPA site, was that a SharePoint site as your source, or was that in some other CMS?
This was a Joomla to SharePoint migration. So the source site was Joomla, and the target was SharePoint. So one of the key indicators that it was Joomla was those icons that are generated here by Joomla, and those are then eliminated by the qualification steps that are added to the inventory robot, and then that intermediate database of content that was generated is then loaded into SharePoint.
Okay, great. The next question is, this one would be, I guess, would be for Stephen, is how is it licensed, the licensing model for the software?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're, if you're leveraging this through SusQtech, we do have a partner discount. So if they're looking, you know, if it's going to take a month, so it is a time-based license. Really, you can as much throughput as you want. And typically these migrations are inside of 3 months. So a 3-month license would be $30K, a 2-month would be $22K, a 1-month would be $12K. And that is if you're using SusQtech services. That is our partner pricing through SusQtech.
Great. I'm going to leave a second. I think those are the only 2 questions we had. Oh, we got one more.
And I'll further say that we've never come across a web content migration of over 1,000 pages where we couldn't build a business case. Certainly when you've got document migrations, those are actually much easier. But if you're looking to do some transformations on the metadata, that's really right up our alley.
Right. Yeah, and the last question here is not really a question, but the power in this is, and I know because you had to go through it fast, is when you set up these robots to run, you kind of get out of this idea of having to have a content freeze, right? So once you set the robot to run and you use that intermediate database and then do transformations based on that, you can continue to do migrations as you're doing other parts of your SharePoint site up until the final migration. So people can continue working on that Joomla site in the example that you showed really up until the final migration. You don't have to basically freeze out that site, move the content to SharePoint, and then move on to another section of the site or some other content. Once the robots are written and all your transformations are done, it's just a matter of running those periodically to refresh the content in your SharePoint site.
That's exactly right.
So,
we can go ahead, David.
I was just going to speak to the timestamps here in the intermediate database and the extracted and last run flag and the object key. These are how this is technically able to happen. We're able to find the deltas on the site. So if you've done the content migration already and you've moved 30,000 elements over, 3 weeks have passed, you run the robots again, it finds the handful of items that were added in the last 2 weeks, and it migrates those over. So it might just be 300-400 items.
Exactly. And, depending on how much transformation you're going to do, that's where I think where a lot of the value comes in, right? So if you're really going from a completely different CMS, and as you go into SharePoint, you're redoing taxonomy and you're redoing tagging and other things, the robots are actually going to do a lot of that transformation, and that's where you're going to save a lot of time. Once you get the robot set up, then it's a matter of whether one piece of content or 100,000 pieces of content, it's going to be able to churn through it all and be 100% accurate.
That is exactly right.
That's right.
Okay. Well, that looks like it's all the questions. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention again that part of the demo that I didn't really get to that's of the big value add that Stephen mentioned is the ability to iterate through your content no matter how messy it is, no matter how many outliers there are. This debug mode will actually identify those outliers. It will identify that messy content, stop the robot, say, this is where we ran into a problem. Regarding this step, how do you want to change it? So you come in here to the Design Studio, make a quick change to that step, go back to debug mode, run it again. So in that way, you're able to knock out these outliers and these differences on the web content in a matter of seconds. So I can make an adjustment here in 30 seconds, go back, run it again in debug mode. Getting through all that messy content, all of those outliers and coding is much more time is involved. So that's really where the savings comes in.
Great. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions. David and Stephen, I want to thank you for your time this afternoon, and I'm going to go ahead and take control back real quick. And if there are any questions, I know we got through the demo kind of quick. If you want to see this in more detail, you can either contact Stephen or myself. Our contact information is on the screen. And we can coordinate a follow-up call or a follow-up demo and talk about any specific questions you have in more detail. And again, our next session is going to be on December the 13th, 2 weeks from today, and we're going to cover some of the new stuff in SharePoint 2013. So we hope to see you then. Thanks, everybody.